thank you, Dr. Paul. So I'm very honoured to be here and to say straight off the bat that this is a new field in most ways for most of us, and I'm not speaking clearly as a medical doctor, but as always, of course, we have to know so many of the basic facts, and it's really good to hear some of that. Maybe duplicate a little bit in some of the points, because in fact, I don't really think we can separate the medical from the ethical from the spiritual, the religious entirely, and that's maybe just the way it's actually going to be for me too. So the whole question about why legalize, I mean, right from the very beginning, I have thought for several years, and maybe many of you have too, that chasing after people because they're possessing, a certain amount of marijuana doesn't seem to be effective. And so that could have led to a decision to decriminalize so that the police weren't spending all their time doing exactly that. But to actually go ahead and legalize it, which is completely different, which gives it now this aura of acceptability, is clearly a whole different question. And the government did set up a task force which reported back to them, and in that task force it was mostly, as you could imagine, medical information about the effects. So the studies were very varied, there were very many, and I would call them, clearly scientifically based, and most of them very clear. And there was actually no enthusiasm from any of the bodies who reported, really, for the availability of marijuana, and especially for youth. The whole question of adult use is slightly different, not completely, but slightly different. But the negatives, I think, were very, very clear. So the government said, well, they thought if they legalized it, it would remove the criminal element from the market, which remains to be seen. And they did say that a lot has been spent on what they're calling ineffective prohibition, and at the same time, of course, then they do stand to gain some increased revenue because of that. But even more so, apart from anything the government said, any of us who grew up during the whole move towards banning cigarette smoking, just completely bewildered by the fact that the government would now move to legalize a different form of smoking. So the negatives are very, very narrowly here. The whole idea that costs of treating abuse could increase as more people are likely to smoke. Although in Portugal, they actually used the savings, the gains from the taxation for treatment and for education. And there will be rising costs of protecting minors in particular through education. And of course, a very, very serious one is the increase in accidents and injuries that have been shown to happen elsewhere. So in other countries, in the few countries where it's completely legalized, so in Uruguay, for example, Stephanie Nolan wrote a really excellent article in the Globe and Mail in March. And this is actually a slightly different tack. This is obstacles to government revenue, that many grow clubs were registered and 10,000 people had registered within a few months just to grow their own plants at home. I know Canada's saying having 4 plants. I have no idea why 4 is the number, but there didn't seem to be a limit on the number in Uruguay. And the medical labs, of course, are working on treatments. They did have problems with international banks. It's maybe not quite so relevant for us, but the US banks cannot trade with them in these areas or do anything with the money that comes from the marijuana producing companies, because it's still a substance 1 controlled substance, a Schedule 1 rather, controlled substance in the US. Part of the problem that the stats in Uruguay are beginning to show is that the type of marijuana that's being used with this high cannabidiol levels. Colorado, and I think you mentioned this, Father Paul, is one of the states in the US that definitely reported increased revenue from taxation, but coupled with an increased crime rate and increased marijuana-related traffic deaths, and an increase in the use of healthcare because of marijuana-related accidents. And especially this kind of accident that, apart from traffic, just due to intoxication, burns, and by young children ingesting edibles that happen to be left around the house. So these are some of the areas that I think we haven't really thought about so much to date, but are possibilities here as well. Talking about adult cannabis use, the whole ethical question of drug taking in general, it's such a vast issue. There isn't really a magisterial teaching from our Roman Catholic Church that deals with this in detail. But of course, anything that leads to our deliberately setting out to lose our own self-control is by definition irrational. And therefore, that is the tack that any teaching would take. So we have to ask ourselves, people have to ask ourselves in society, why do we do these things? The whole question of motivation. Is it just for pleasure or recreation? It's called recreational marijuana, but is there an avoidance level? The whole question of why we take drugs is something that hasn't really been looked into in any real depth. It's a whole different question. CAMH has done many studies on this, and they have linked regular use, adult regular use, with the items listed there, so depression, anxiety, and also they list stats about the increased injuries and risks of death from motor vehicle collisions in particular. And there are links, and I appreciate what Dr. Paul was saying about the different way in which the studies have been graded. Most of them do talk about strong links, medium links, and weak links, causal and effect in that sense. So they never claim more than they can actually prove with the evidence available. But the CAMH, with many other places too, do link a causal effect as far as schizophrenia, chronic bronchitis, and lung cancer are concerned. And they have listed 287 deaths, this is from cannabis use, and 66,346 disability-adjusted life years, as they called it in 2012. I don't have more up-to-date figures, but I imagine, again, that's the sort of thing that's likely to be even higher. Every other report, including from CAMH, is focused on prevention, which means say no, really, and on harm reduction. So we can see where the medical response is coming from. And this is recreational marijuana. There do seem to be significant allowances for its use, medical marijuana in specific situations, whether or not the links are cause-effect, again, are completely strong or completely proven, remains, I think, to be seen. But it's being used for a completely different purpose, and I think that puts it in a different ethical scale right from the very beginning. But there is this existing knowledge of the adverse effects that Dr. Paul was talking about, especially on youth. And it really makes me question this legalization aspect that consumers are willing to accept these adverse risks just for the sake of getting high. And it just seems to me, so I'll just use the word completely disproportionate. And also, I think we've all noticed, apart from, I presume nobody here has any shares in any of these cannabis companies, but it's been a wild ride for the past few months. I've just been reading it out of interest, the immense rates at which the shares are being sold. And even companies that we would have thought of as family-friendly, for example, Coca-Cola is just talking about getting in the action, of course not in the States because they can't, but in Canada now that it's going to be legal, because they're talking about having infused drinks with cannabis in some form infused. So you're going to have to watch which can you pick up when you're at the supermarket in a few months. It really seems to me very, very strange. So the long-term effects, and I'm still talking about adults here, but it's not, it's maybe not the same. I just think it's so completely ridiculous for young people. But the long-term effects in adults, of course, we have to also be careful about. As I said, the studies have been careful and they're varied, as we would expect medical information to be. But nearly everybody agrees that more longitudinal studies are needed before more cause and effect can be tied together or let go as not being valid. And the whole question of use in terms of regular use of cannabis leads to other drugs. Again, the studies are varied, and I think, again, more studies are needed. But that's not to say there isn't some substantial links already established. So from a social point of view, just something like the effects on transport. So we're talking about our trains, our GO trains, so we're talking about our ordinary flights, we're talking about trucking companies. The TTC actually urged the government to include mandatory random drug testing. That hasn't happened. And in fact, Bill C-46 did not give, oh, that should say employers, didn't give employers any additional rights to screen their employees for drugs and alcohol. And some companies do tests, but these are subject to court challenges and arbitration. And some train drivers, truck drivers, or heavy machinery workers are subject to mandatory testing, but it's usually after a collision to determine the state they were in, and it's not random. So again, that idea of the society that we're living in, these are areas that we're all going to have to think about very carefully. In the courts, from the legal side, the courts have been very reluctant to introduce mandatory testing. They do see this as an invasion of privacy, and to a certain extent it is, of course. But when we think, and especially these days again with our emphasis on autonomy, individual rights, it is one thing for me to say no because it's invading my privacy, but society has forgotten to look at the importance of the common good as well, where I would, in some situations, I think, as in many other situations, be willing to undergo something like that in the hope that people who actually are users, that they would be caught. So it seems to me a not very rational way of approaching this particular issue. It's kind of interesting too that many of the unions say that the existing testing is adequate and they're resistant to more testing. I see these as ethical issues because they really, I think, should be thinking in a slightly different way in terms of protecting the rest of us. It seems for ordinary driving, it isn't clear how much people have to consume before they become impaired. It seems to be very hard to gauge their fitness, and the same tests as for alcohol don't seem to be effective. The whole question of roadside testing is up in the air at the minute. There are again stats for and against, and the Transport Minister is currently reviewing the situation. I think again this is completely unethical. If you're going to legalise something, this sort of thing should have been done long before. That doesn't mean that I approve of legalisation. I'm just saying if there's legalisation, and there is, these sorts of studies should have been done long before to protect society in general. So everything just seems to have been left to the last minute. I'm just talking in broad sweeps here clearly, another area is behaviour modelling in families, just the way my parents used to smoke cigarettes. It was just the done thing, nobody questioned it. It really was a social way, and some of them presumably became addicted to nicotine, but it really started off as a social activity, if you like, until more and more medical evidence came to light that really led to the whole prohibition of smoking in public places, all that kind of thing. So if parents smoke up or vape or make baked goods or drink infused liquids, then the impact that's going to have on their immediate family and in society in general has to be something we have to figure with. And people say that, well, it's really just the same as alcohol. And as I said earlier, there's no real magisterial teaching against alcohol. It's never about the use of something so much as the abuse of something, which leads us to, it is a question really again of that self-control and why we're actually using certain substances. But when we start to talk about youth, I think it's a completely different story. I think it really should be zero tolerance. And when we're saying youth these days, I think even our society has adapted its margins in terms of who's included in youth. And now I think because of all the studies that have been done in neuroplasticity in the developing brain, if it is correct that our brains don't really sort of stop forming in that sense till we're about 24 or 25, then this, the whole question of cannabis is quite different again in terms of the age at which people should be allowed to legally use it, as opposed to even something like alcohol. So it's by far the biggest concern, ethically, medically, any kind of way, in terms of what will happen to our youth. Their motivation as well, but also the effects, especially the effects on their minds and their bodies. This particular study, the Adolescent Health Committee of the Canadian Pediatric Society, is the one I'm really using when I mention some statistics from now on in. I recommend, if you're really interested, that you read this one. First of all, it is Canadian, so it's highly relevant, and it was done in preparation for the government actually moving towards legalization. And again, there's very little in it that one would say they're enthusiastic about the use of marijuana. So they talk about the short and the long-term effects, because we have to look at both. The most important one being that at least regular use can cause functional and structural changes to the developing brain. You would think that would be enough to sort of make us stop right there. So marijuana in this particular age group is strongly linked, and this is according to the studies, cannabis dependence and other substance abuse disorders, as well as tobacco smoking, and mental illness, depression, anxiety, and psychosis. And so it also involves impaired neurological development and the whole question of cognitive decline. Diminished school performance, of course, the spillover from the actual physical and mental effects, and even lifetime achievement. And this last bit, I think, maybe shouldn't be there particularly with that. But just again, the whole question of rates of hospitalization for young children who have unintentionally picked up on something that's at home has increased. And as Dr. Paul mentioned, the type of cannabis that's being used nowadays is at least 2 to 4 times stronger than the cannabis that was being used in the 60s, 70s, with significant effects because of that too. The whole question then really in this area, I think in particular, really should rest on how we view and how we recognize that for young people, this brain plasticity is of the utmost importance, and not only at that immediate time, but the long-term neural effects. I think it's going to take an immense amount of education for our young people to start thinking that way. Canada has the highest use of cannabis in all the developed countries. I was kind of surprised at that. I don't know why, but I was. Because there's nothing that really says why that is. Very, very hard to work that out. The figures are quite startling. About a quarter of the population between ages 15 and 24, so right in that age where the neuroplasticity is still a problem, reported use last year, mainly males. I'm not exactly sure why that is either, but it's statistically accurate. And the 28% of youth aged 11 to 15 used marijuana last year. So for example, my eldest grandson is 13, he's in grade 7. Some of the kids he's probably hanging out with have maybe tried this a couple of years even before that. And this is before it's legal. Some of the high-risk sectors in Canadian youth, again, the Atlantic and the Western provinces have higher rates. The reasons, not entirely clear if ever that will be found. But the Indigenous people, again, are particularly at risk. And the figures here are kind of startling, that nearly 2/3 of young people between ages 15 and 19 from Inuvik reported use in 2016. Now this was not daily use or regular use, but even at that age, 2/3 is an incredibly high proportion. And in Ontario, 13.85 of 7th to 12th graders reported use in the past month, well, in 2015 when the study was actually done. And in the 12th graders were reporting highest daily use, which you can see the possible consequences of that, at 5.6%. When we have young people driving, we know from our insurance payments that that's the age that still is most problematic, and now we're just talking statistically. So add something like cannabis to the mix, and so it shows that the studies again that impaired driving is more prevalent among adolescents even than alcohol. And in 2015, 9.8 students in Ontario admitted to driving after cannabis use at least once during the previous year. And while blood ethanol levels are measurable for alcohol, there still does seem to be a problem in terms of measuring for acute cannabis use. one of the other problems with the whole question of impairment is that ingestibles can take 6 hours to show effects. So people can presumably then feel as if they're doing very well, but in fact their body's going to show something quite differently 6 hours later when they maybe think you're safe to drive. That same study talked about how anybody who was using cannabis, how there were links with other substances, and perhaps not surprisingly, most closely tied to alcohol and tobacco. And their studies showed that the use of marijuana and alcohol at age 18 is indicative of heavy drinking at age 35. Again, with the trying to move people away from addiction to nicotine, then mixing tobacco and cannabis, since these seem to come into play with cannabis users, contributes even more to dependence because now there's 2 substances at least at work. And there's this stat that showed up that I just thought must be relevant, but I just sort of came out of the blue at me, that it's associated with a 6-fold increase in ecstasy use. And I know ecstasy is I don't know if it's even still the drug of choice at nightclubs, etc., but it was for many years. And again, on the whole, that's a fairly young group that we're talking about, the age-related questions too. That whole question of dependence, to me, is addiction, if you like. Dependence is one of the biggest ethical concerns I would have with anything to do with cannabis. To say that 1 in 6 adolescents who use cannabis will meet the criteria for dependence is a very high statistic. And Dr. Paul mentioned these 2 additions to the psychiatric manual where all the different psychiatric conditions are listed, and they are just new. Cannabis use disorder with the functional impairment and what you might expect, reduced academic achievement, actual social interaction as well, conflict with family, all coming under that. And cannabis withdrawal symptom, with young people showing irritability, anxiety, depression, sleep disturbance, appetite changes. So very broadly, it really does raise significant issues, behavioral issues for the individual and for society. The whole question of not doing well at school and being difficult to catch up later depending on how regular the usage is, up until say age 24. The crime rates, the delinquency, how that usually affects people over the lifespan. The whole question of avoidance of reality. When we're adolescents, that's when we're growing into a maturity, beginning to work out how to handle reality, working through all the usual adolescent questions, you might say. It's a normal part of development. So for that to be interfered with and not learning how to deal properly with reality, to use avoidance techniques, again, doesn't help the individual, certainly does not help society. There was one little interesting comment I read just very recently, an American psychologist, that said, looking at the numbers of Canadian youth that use cannabis, if that continues, and as it's expected to accelerate with the legalization, then she just made the comment that the overall IQ level in this country will be significantly lower. And I thought, if that doesn't make people waking up and think, these are the people who'll be running the country and we're in a bad enough mess as it is. So with something like this to add to it, she was being serious, of course, and I thought that was really strange that a society would actually want to be less capable rather than more. So general ethical considerations, and I will just finish up. Societal attitudes are saying it's legal, which is usual in moral terms. If it's legal, that means it's okay, it's acceptable, it's doable, don't get too upset about it, all those kind of things, just accept it. We have actually I had where will people smoke, that was just answered today as well, because Doug Ford said that it will tie in with wherever people are allowed to smoke cigarettes, they'll be able to smoke marijuana. Actually, I just came past the Kelly Library, sorry, no, it had nothing to do with the fact it was Kelly, I was just passing it. There was somebody standing in the doorway, you know, that smell of just came wafting down the passage, and I thought, that's one person, you can smell it, maybe not a mile away, okay. But if that's going to be happening more and more, you know, this is just my own bias, and I can't stand the smell of the stuff, but imagine what it will be like in general. So anyway, will we be able to eat ingestibles in coffee shops? They won't know what's in your brownie if you bring it in, that kind of thing. Some of these questions might look a little bit light, but they could be fairly serious if we're visiting people's homes or going to parties or going to places where we don't know everybody. What's available? How can we work this sort of thing out? Just the fact, again, because it's legal, people will think that this sort of thing should be perfectly acceptable. And very broad terms again, life and health risks for non-users, public safety, land, sea and air, of course. Dr. Paul mentioned the military and defense consequences, and many of us remember what happened in Vietnam, the trials of the American soldiers, and the consistently high drug use. All those sorts of things. This is not a blame thing. This is just what actually can happen. Now that it will be legal, how will that be? It may be said that you may not do this, but how will it be enforced? So I do think that we have a lot of social and ethical questions which really call for a political reaction, so that now we're faced with a society where marijuana is legal, but there's still a lot we can do in pressing for age-related, and pointing out all the sort of hazards that exist there for our young people. I think absolutely zero tolerance is the only way to do it. Thanks.